My first job in philanthropy was literally right out of college, working for the American Cancer Society. I was an area representative responsible for 3 counties where I had 3 individual boards where I was responsible for working with them on their fundraising, their education issues, their public awareness issues. And after 2 years, I had the opportunity to then go to a hospital in Grand Rapids called St. Mary's Hospital, where I got into philanthropy there, which was, I would say, even more sophisticated philanthropy. Had the opportunity to work with some really well-trained fundraisers. And then shortly after that, after about 2 years, was recruited to Hackley Hospital, where I joined their marketing staff and was actually asked to help develop a development program at Hackley Hospital, which has its own set of challenges but opportunities also. And then after that, I had this really unique opportunity to go work as a program associate at the Council of Michigan Foundations, when they had just received a $36 million grant from the Kellogg Foundation to make sure that every citizen in the state of Michigan had access to a community foundation, but equally important to start introducing philanthropy in a meaningful way to young people. And because of some prior work I had done in my volunteer work of working with and empowering young people, they asked me to come on board and assist somewhat with the creation of the community foundations, but most importantly in helping establish the youth advisory councils. 2 years after that, sounds as if I can't keep a job, I got this wonderful phone call from this gentleman by the name of Dr. Mawby. And Dr. Mawby was the chairman and CEO at the Kellogg Foundation at the time. And he asked me if I'd be willing to come on and serve as his executive assistant. And I jumped at the opportunity. And I'll never forget, after my interview with him, I came home and I told my wife I had accepted a job with the Kellogg Foundation. And she said, "Perfect, what does it pay?" And I had no idea what it paid. I was just so excited to be work at Kellogg and to be able to sit at the side of Russ Mawby, who is just an icon in philanthropy. And then it's just been 19 years that I've had the privilege of increased responsibilities and leadership opportunities at the Kellogg Foundation that has just been a real blessing for me. So you get this phone call. This is before we all had cell phones, and I was in Indiana for a meeting, and I called back to my office, and my secretary said, "Dr. Mawby called." And I thought, oh my goodness, I must have really screwed up something if the chairman of the Kellogg Foundation has called me, who I didn't even think he knew who I was. And she said, "And by the way, before you call Dr. Mawby back, you need to talk to Dottie Johnson, who was my boss at the Council of Michigan Foundations." So I called Dottie, and she said, "Look, Russ has been observing you, and he called to see if I would give him permission to talk to you about being his executive assistant." So I was flattered. I'd called Dr. Mawby that evening, and he said, "Look, could you come out on Thursday after work, come out to the farm, and you could help me do chores, and we could have supper, and we could talk about the opportunity." And I said, "Well, I'd be honored to, Dr. Mawby." I went to Dottie the next day, and I said, "Dottie, what does one wear to a job interview with the chairman of the Kellogg Foundation while doing chores at his farm?" I said, "Do I wear barn boots and jeans, or do I just unbutton my top button and loosen my tie?" So I found something in between. And literally when I got to Russ's, he was in his casual shirt and blue jeans, and we went out to the barn and we started moving bales of hay, and we walked down to the pasture and started bringing horses up to the barn. We got in his golf cart and started riding around the back 40, and 1 minute we're talking about wildflowers in the pasture, the next minute we're talking about the artificial boundaries between Mexico and the United States. We then went into this small little diner in Hickory Corners with he and his wife Ruth at the time. And his daughter and granddaughter just happened to show up. Well, I finally asked him several months later, after he offered me this job, I said, "So can you explain this interview with me?" And he said, "You need to understand, as my executive assistant, there are times when you're going to be sitting at the table with the head of state, and there's going to be a time that you're going to be in a barrio outside of Mexico City, and I just needed to see how you could operate in each of those settings." So it was a really unique interview for me, and I've taken parts of that and have tried to use some of that myself when I interview potential program officers to really see. It's one thing to prepare for an interview, but it's another thing to see someone, how they behave in communities, how they interact with grantees, how they interact with people who the foundation and grantees are trying to serve. It was a wonderful lesson. I think when you reflect, or people really take the time to reflect of how they got into this, they all have some interesting, unique situations that occurred in their lives. I was the youngest of 4 boys, and I had parents who were very involved with our church and with our school. And you know, back in the days when telephones had cords and they plugged into a wall, I remember as a toddler literally sitting at my mother's feet with my trucks and my toys while she was on the phone, you know, calling people who were on her school board or on this church committee or whatever. I remember during the day going to committee meetings with her or spending weekends with my dad while he was organizing the church fundraiser or doing whatever it was. And this was just a way of life for us. So I assumed as I was growing up that I too would be a volunteer. I didn't think of, gee, there's actually jobs in this sector. But then I think the real turning point for me was when I was in high school. I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer that resulted in the amputation of my left leg. And I started realizing that there were organizations that my family was tapping into and benefiting from that were nonprofit organizations, and started realizing that, maybe this is a sector I could end up working in. At first in college, I kind of became the poster child for the American Cancer Society. I was flying all over the country speaking at fundraisers for the ACS, and one of those typical fundraisers where you tell them about your cancer as a child, you get them to cry, you tell some bad one-legged jokes, and then they're ready to give. So I worked for the American Cancer Society right out of college for 2 years. And then I realized what I wanted to do for the ACS was really more on the volunteer side. So I stayed in the sector, but went to hospital fundraising. And while I was at the hospital, I took it upon myself, crazy as I was, to start a camp for children with cancer. Because when I was treated for cancer, I was treated at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, but as a 17-year-old, I was on a floor with a bunch of other adults. And I really felt I could have benefited from being with other young people who were going through the same experience. So I felt there was a need to start bringing young people together who were dealing with some of the similar issues. And, at 24 years of age when I started that, I probably had no right doing such a thing, bringing a bunch of sick kids together in a camp for a week during the summer. And after my first year of that camp, I realized that my board of directors, which of course was all adults, was starting to make some decisions of future activities at the camp that contrary to what the kids had said in their surveys. So the board was saying, well, we don't want to do this, and the kids are telling us that's their favorite thing to do. So I said, well, how do I deal with this issue? So I started putting young people on our board and started putting young people on the various committees, and it was remarkable the ownership that these kids started taking on the camp, some of the discipline problems that I as a director used to deal with some of the kids, as kids would start dealing with one-on-one with their peers. So that got me interested in kind of this whole youth leadership, youth empowerment piece. Then I had the opportunity to go to Hackley Hospital doing fundraising there. There was an opportunity for me to look at how to create a camp in the former Soviet Union to serve kids who had acquired various forms of cancer as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. And I was informed of this woman down in Grand Haven, Michigan, who might be a resource for me to find some funding to start such a camp in the former Republic of Belarus. And I sat down with her. They were Dottie Johnson and Kathy Agard. And I asked them for some advice where I could get some funding. They had really no good advice for me whatsoever, but 2 weeks later I got a phone call and they were asking me if I'd be willing to consider a job with the Council of Michigan Foundations because of that strong youth component, and they're aware of the work that I was doing. So it was really kind of serendipity. If I'm looking at my own personal experiences that were both joyful as a child, going places with my parents, then what in a sense at the time was somewhat tragic, being diagnosed with cancer, being given 3 years to live, realizing maybe there's something I could do professionally in this field to help eradicate cancer. And then I was able to take that and get more involved in volunteerism, and then how it parlayed into a field of philanthropy. And I think that was probably the roadmap that took me into this amazing field that we call philanthropy, and then just an extraordinary privilege I've had to be able to work with the Agards and the Johnsons and the Mobbies and the Richardsons and the Norm Browns and the Sterling Spearns, and being able to meet so many other extraordinary people throughout this world who realize that it doesn't require $1 million grant or a $10 million grant. Sometimes it's how can we make a small grant so these rural communities can have bikes so kids can get from one point to another, or they can pick up the eggs and then ride them into town so they can sell them, or helping this woman acquire, a rooster and a hen so she can start her own business and be very satisfied and support her family.